The prairie wind blew dry and hollow that morning, carrying with it the scent of dust, despair, and old dreams. The sun had been merciless for weeks, baking the earth into cracks deep enough to swallow a man's faith. On the far edge of the frontier, where the hills rolled like the backs of sleeping beasts, a ranch sat half forgotten, its fences leaning, its barns sighing in the heat, and its owner, a man named Caleb Rourke, standing on the porch with his hat low and his heart even lower. Caleb had buried more than cattle in the last 2 years. The fever had taken his wife and the baby she'd never got to name. The town preacher said time would heal him, but time had done little more than steal his softness and leave behind something carved out of silence and duty. He worked the land alone, fed the horses before himself, and when night came, he sat by the dying fire, watching the shadows stretch long enough to swallow the walls. He'd stopped expecting visitors. Out here, people didn't come unless they needed something, or unless death had sent them. That's why, when he saw the figure moving slow along the dirt road, clutching a child in her arms and leading another by the hand, he didn't wave. He just watched. From a distance, the woman looked like a ghost made of dust and determination. Her dress was torn, her bonnet limp, and the children beside her, one barely old enough to walk, the other no more than 8, looked hollow-eyed, their cheeks drawn tight from hunger. Caleb stepped off the porch, his boots crunching against the grit. The closer they came, the clearer their suffering grew. The woman's lips were cracked, her eyes shadowed. But even in her ruin, there was something fierce in the way she stood, a spine of iron under all that frailty. When she finally reached the fence, she stopped. The children clung to her skirt. Her voice came out barely more than a whisper, hoarse as wind over bone. "Sir, we haven't eaten in 5 days." For a long breath, the world seemed to stop, no bird, no breeze, just the sound of her words hanging in the emptiness. Caleb didn't speak. He just turned toward the house, slow and steady, like a man fighting the ghosts of his own hesitation. Inside there wasn't much, some beans, a heel of bread, and half a jar of molasses. He'd been saving it for Sunday, but the look in that woman's eyes burned through every selfish thought he had left. He cut the bread thick and uneven and carried it back outside. The children's eyes followed his hands like they were watching a miracle unfold. He handed the bread to the woman. She didn't take it right away, like she couldn't believe it was real. When she did, her hands trembled, and for a moment she closed her eyes, pressing the crust to her lips without eating, as if it were holy. He watched her break the bread in 2, giving each half to her children before taking the smallest piece for herself. Caleb cleared his throat. "There's more inside. You and the young'uns can come in, rest a spell." She looked up, and for the first time he saw her eyes, not the hunger or the fear, but the pride, the kind that keeps a soul standing when the world wants it to kneel. "We don't mean to trouble you, mister," she said softly. "Trouble's better than ghosts," he replied, "and I've got plenty of those already." That night, the woman and her children slept in the spare room, the one that still smelled faintly of lilac soap and memory. Caleb sat by the fire, listening to the quiet creak of the floorboards, the sound of small breathing behind the door. It had been years since his home had sounded like that, alive. In the morning, he found her in the yard, mending a torn hem with fingers that still shook from weakness. The children chased a chicken through the dust, laughing for the first time in who knows how long. "You plan on moving along?" Caleb asked, leaning against the porch post. She nodded, not meeting his gaze. "Soon as I find work. My husband's gone. Was a farmer. Lost him last winter to the cold. Been walking ever since." "What's your name?" "Mara Jennings," she said, standing straight again. "And these are my boys, Henry and Eli." He tipped his hat. "Caleb Rourke." There was a silence then, not awkward, just heavy with things neither of them needed to say. The land out here had a way of teaching people how to talk without words. Days turned into a week. Caleb offered them a roof and food, saying he could use help with the chores. Mara worked from sunrise to dusk, feeding chickens, mending clothes, cooking meals with what little they had. She never complained, though her hands blistered and her eyes sometimes filled when she thought no one was looking. Caleb noticed. He noticed everything, the way she hummed when the boys slept, the way she whispered grace over every meal, even when there was hardly enough to bless. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains, fierce and wild. Thunder cracked the sky open like Judgment Day. Caleb went out to secure the barn doors, and when he came back, Mara was standing at the window, the lantern light turning her face golden against the black night. She turned to him, her voice low. "You gave us bread when we had nothing. Why?" He stared into the fire. "Maybe I was tired of watching things die on this land." She nodded slowly. "The Lord sent you to us." He shook his head. "I ain't much for the Lord these days." She smiled, a faint, sad smile that carried both loss and forgiveness. "Maybe he's still much for you." The thunder outside seemed to answer her words. In the days that followed, something unspoken began to grow between them. It wasn't the wild rush of young love, but something slower, deeper, like the roots of a tree finding water in dry ground. He found himself setting an extra plate without thinking. She began humming louder, as if the house itself had started breathing again. Then came the day the sheriff rode up. He brought news. A gang had been roaming near the valley, stealing horses, raiding empty homes. He looked at Mara with pity and recognition. "You're the widow from Black Hollow, ain't you? Heard about what happened?" Her eyes went wide. Caleb didn't ask, but later that night, she told him how the gang had burned her home, how her husband had fought to protect them and never made it out of the flames, how she'd been running since. Caleb listened, his fists clenched. "You're safe here," he said finally. "Ain't no one taken from you again." And he meant it. That night he loaded his rifle and sat by the door till dawn, listening for hoofbeats. None came, but the sound of her quiet breathing from the next room was enough to keep him awake. By the end of that week, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let her walk away. When the morning sun painted the sky in pale gold, Caleb found Mara on the porch, watching her boys play with a handmade wooden horse he'd carved. He stepped up beside her, hands rough and unsure. "Mara," he said, voice low, "I ain't a rich man. Don't got much left to give, but this land's all I got, and I'd give it to you if you'd stay." She turned, eyes shining. "You're offering me work?" He shook his head. "I'm offering you a home." "And my name?" The wind fell silent for a moment, as if even the prairie was listening. Tears filled her eyes, glinting like dawn after a storm. She reached out, touching his calloused hand with trembling fingers. "Caleb Rourke," she whispered. "You already gave me life when you handed me that bread." And for the first time in years, Caleb smiled, a true, unguarded smile. The widow had come seeking food, but what she found was grace. And the rancher, who had long since buried his heart, found it again in the eyes of a woman who refused to let hope die. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain, not the dry kind that teased the ground, but the kind that promised life. It was a new beginning, born not from plenty but from compassion, and the quiet strength of two souls who'd known hunger, loss, and the mercy of a shared meal. The wind carried a strange hush that morning, the kind that crawls under the skin and whispers of coming trouble. The sky over the plains was bruised purple, heavy with the promise of rain, or something worse. Caleb Rourke stood at the edge of his porch, watching the horizon where dust rose like ghosts. Mara was inside, washing the boys' hands for breakfast. Her laughter floated through the open window, light and uncertain, like a song rediscovered after years of silence. It had been 3 months since the day she whispered his name with tears in her eyes, the day he offered her not just shelter but his heart. They'd married quietly under the cottonwood by the creek, with the preacher from town and 2 ranch hands as witnesses. No fancy vows, no white dress, just the sound of wind through the grass and the smell of earth after rain. But for Caleb it was enough. For the first time, since the fever had taken his world, he felt the land breathe again. Life on the ranch began to find rhythm once more. Mara tended the home with the same fierce devotion she'd shown when she first arrived, while Caleb worked the fields from dawn until the stars came out. The boys, Henry and little Eli, followed him everywhere, their laughter echoing across the pasture. They called him Pa now, though at first it had been awkward on their tongues. The words settled into his soul like sunlight through storm clouds. But peace on the frontier is as fragile as a spider's web. It was near sunset when the sheriff rode up again. Dust caked on his coat and a grim set to his jaw. Caleb met him at the gate, already sensing the weight the man carried. "Rourke," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "Need to speak with you and your wife." Mara came out, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes met the sheriff's, and in that instant, the quiet peace of their day shattered. "They're back," he said. "The same gang that burned Black Hollow. Word is they're heading this way, raiding homesteads, taking horses and women. You best be ready." Caleb's stomach turned to stone. He remembered the fear in Mara's eyes when she first told him. About that night, the smell of smoke, the sound of her husband's last breath, her children screaming in the dark. "Do you know how many?" Caleb asked. 6, maybe 7 men, mean ones, led by a fella named Clay Boone. You remember the name? Caleb nodded slowly. Boone, he'd heard it before, back when he was still breaking. Horses for the army. A man with no loyalty but to his gun. After the sheriff left, Caleb checked every rifle, sharpened every blade, and reinforced the barn doors. He didn't tell Mara everything, but she knew. She always knew. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep, Mara stood by the window watching the storm clouds roll in from the west. Lightning flashed on the horizon, lighting up her face in silver and shadow. "Do you think they'll come?" she asked softly. Caleb came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "If they do," he said, "they'll find I'm not the man I used to be." She turned to him then, her eyes glistening. "You were a good man before I came here. You gave when you had nothing. Don't lose that now." He kissed her forehead. "If it's between kindness and keeping you safe, I'll choose you every time." The storm broke before midnight. Rain came hard, drumming the roof like gunfire. Caleb sat near the window with his rifle across his knees. The boys slept in the next room, Mara beside them, whispering prayers he could barely hear. And then, over the roar of the storm, came the sound of hooves. Caleb's heart dropped. He stepped out into the downpour, the cold biting through his shirt. Lightning cracked the sky open, and in that blinding flash he saw them, 5 riders, silhouettes against the ridge, moving slow and deliberate toward the ranch. "Stay inside!" he shouted toward the house. But Mara was already at the door, holding a lantern high, her face pale but steady. The riders circled the yard like wolves, their laughter carrying through the rain. The leader dismounted, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar down his cheek that glistened in the lightning. "Well, I'll be damned," Clay Boone said, his grin wide and cruel. "Didn't expect to find company out here. Ain't you the widow from Black Hollow?" Mara said nothing. Caleb stepped forward, rifle raised. "You're not taking another thing from this land, Boone." Boone laughed. "You Rourke, ain't you? Heard you were tough once. Shame you're playing house with another man's woman now." The words hit like a slap, but Caleb didn't move. He just kept the barrel leveled at Boone's chest. The rain soaked them both, thunder splitting the sky as the other men shifted uneasily behind their leader. "Walk away," Caleb said. "Ain't no gold here, no cattle worth stealing. Just leave." Boone's grin twisted. "You think I came for cattle?" His eyes flicked toward Mara. "She ran from me, Rourke. I never got to finish what I started that night." The world turned red in Caleb's mind. He fired first. The shot split the air, echoing like vengeance across the plains. Boone stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, then roared with rage. Gunfire erupted. Caleb dove behind the trough, returning fire as bullets tore through the rain. The horses screamed, lightning flashing like the fury of God himself. Mara dragged the boys under the bed, whispering prayers over their ears. One of the outlaws fell, another fled. Boone kept coming, blood streaming down his arm. He reached the porch, swinging his revolver up, only for Mara to appear in the doorway, Caleb's old shotgun in her hands. "Get away from my home," she said, her voice steady as stone. Boone sneered. "You think you'll shoot me, widow?" "I already did once," she said, and she pulled the trigger. The blast threw Boone backward into the mud. The thunder swallowed his last breath. When it was over, the rain slowed to a whisper. Caleb dropped his rifle and ran to her. She stood trembling, the shotgun smoking in her hands, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," he whispered, wrapping her in his arms. "It's over now. The sheriff came 2 days later to collect the bodies and say words no one wanted to hear. Caleb didn't speak much. He just held Mara close, their fingers laced like roots in the hard ground. Weeks passed. The fields began to green again. The storm that had broken their peace had also washed the dust from the land. Mara planted a garden where Boone had fallen, tomatoes, corn, and wildflowers that grew bright and defiant under the summer sun. One evening, as the light faded and the boys chased fireflies across the yard, Caleb sat on the porch whittling a new toy horse. Mara came out with 2 cups of coffee, her hair loose in the breeze. "Hard to believe it's only been a year since we met," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "Feels like I've lived a lifetime since." She smiled. "You gave us bread when we hadn't eaten in 5 days. You gave us your home, your name, your heart." He looked at her, his rough hands stilling on the wood. "You gave me something too, Mara. You gave me a reason to live again." The sky burned orange as the sun dipped below the hills. The land stretched endless and alive, no longer barren, but full of promise. Caleb reached for her hand. "I used to think God forgot about me out here," he said. "But maybe he was just waiting to send you." Mara leaned against his shoulder. "Sometimes the miracle ain't in the thunder or the lightning. Sometimes it's in the bread we share when the world's gone dry." They sat there until the stars came out, the boys' laughter fading into the sound of crickets. The ranch was quiet but not empty. It was alive, reborn through kindness, courage, and the love that had grown from one simple act of mercy. And on that vast prairie, under a sky wide enough to hold all their pain and hope, the widow and the rancher built a life not out of riches, but out of grace.